everyone. Today we will discuss about the neural pathway. The objectives are to learn about the pyramidal tract, the pathway for pain and temperature, the pathway for proprioceptive impulses, the taste pathway, visual pathway, olfactory pathway. So, the neural pathway, it may be the sensory pathway or the motor pathway. In the sensory pathway, the stimulus or the impulses is carried from the periphery and transmitted to the brain, whereas in motor pathway, that is from the brain to the periphery. So, we are having the motor and the descending or the efferent pathways. Here it is depicted in red color, and the sensory and ascending or the afferent pathways, here it is depicted in the blue color. So, the motor pathway includes either pyramidal tracts or the extrapyramidal tracts. So, the pyramidal tracts includes the lateral corticospinal tract, then anterior corticospinal tract. The extrapyramidal tracts includes the rubrospinal tract, the reticulospinal tract, the olivospinal tract and vestibulospinal tract. The sensory or the ascending pathways includes the gracile fasciculus, then cuneate fasciculus, the posterior spinocerebellar tract and the anterior spinocerebellar tract. Then in the anterolateral system, we are having the lateral spinothalamic tract and anterior spinothalamic tract. So, now we will learn about the motor neurons and the which is including the upper motor neuron and lower motor neuron. The upper motor neuron, the cell bodies or the Betz cell present in the precentral sulcus area of the cerebrum, whereas the cell bodies of the lower motor neuron is present in the anterior horn of the grey matter in the spinal cord. The axon of the upper motor neuron passes through the internal capsule, pons and medulla, whereas the motor neurons, the motor end plates of each nerve and muscle fibers, they supply and form a motor unit. So, the axons of the upper motor neuron make up the pyramidal tracts and decussate in the medulla oblongata, forming the pyramids. So, here we can observe the upper motor neurons and the lower motor neurons. So, now we will discuss about the pyramidal tract. So, the pyramidal tract is a descending tract. It is extending from the cerebral cortex to various motor nuclei of the cranial and spinal nerves. So, it constitutes the upper motor neuron in the motor pathway from the cortex to the voluntary muscles. So, it includes corticospinal tract that supplies the musculature of the axial extremity and the corticobulbar tracts that supplies the musculature of the head and neck. The origin, each pyramidal tract contains about 1 million fibers that originates from the motor area 4 of the cortex, the premotor area, area number 6 and also the synesthetic area, area number 3 to 1. So, when we observe this diagram, we can observe the body is represented upside down. The areas for the legs and the perineum lie in the paracentral lobule. The angle of the mouth, tongue, larynx, the thumb and the great toe are represented by relatively large areas. So, it is the movements which are represented in the cortex rather than the individual muscles. The course, the tract passes through the following parts of the central nervous system, that is corona radiata, internal capsule occupying the genu and the anterior 2/3 of the posterior limb, middle 2/3 of the crus cerebri of the midbrain, the basilar part of the pons, pyramid of the medulla. So, in the lower part of the medulla, about 75 to 80% of the fibers cross to the opposite side and descend as the lateral corticospinal tract. About 20% of the fibers remain uncrossed and run down as the anterior or the uncrossed corticospinal tract. Thus, in the spinal cord, there are two corticospinal tracts, that is the lateral crossed and the anterior uncrossed, and most of the uncrossed fibers crossed the opposite side before termination. So, diagrammatically we can represent the pyramidal tract like this, which is a simpler form. Then the termination, before termination all the fibers cross to the opposite side and they terminate through the interneuron in the motor nuclei of cranial nerves in relation to anterior on cells of the spinal cord, and they collectively form the corticonuclear tract. The functions of the pyramidal tract is concerned with the voluntary movements of the body, and possibly it is also a path for superficial reflexes. The clinical aspect, the lesions above the level of decussation causes contralateral paralysis. The lesions below the decussation causes ipsilateral paralysis. So, the paralysis is of upper motor neuron type and it is characterized by loss of power of voluntary movements, clasp knife type of spasticity, exaggerated tendon reflexes, Babinski sign is positive and reaction to degeneration is absent. So, the effects of lesion in the primary motor area includes the contralateral flaccid paralysis, that is initially, and decreased deep tendon reflex, the positive Babinski sign and moderate recovery of the function. Now, the pathway of pain and temperature. The receptors are the free endings of the pain, that includes the end bulbs of Krause for cold, the organs of Ruffini for warmth and the Golgi Mazzoni for heat. The neurons includes, the first neuron is located in the dorsal root ganglion. So, peripheral processes of the neurons in the ganglia constitute the sensory nerves. These processes end in relation to the receptors. The central process of the neurons pass through the dorsal nerve roots to enter the spinal cord where they synapse with the second neuron. So, the second neuron is located in the grey matter of the spinal cord. Their axons form the lateral spinothalamic tract. This tract is crossed. It ascends to the lateral white column of the spinal cord to enter the brainstem. So, in the brainstem this tract is referred to as the spinal lemniscus to end in the thalamus. So, the third neuron lies in the posterolateral ventral nucleus of thalamus. The fiber arising from this nucleus pass through the internal capsule and the corona radiata to reach the somatosensory area, that is area number 312 of the cerebral cortex. So, the pathway for touch. Here the receptors include the tactile Meissner corpuscles, the Merkel's discs and the free nerve endings around the air follicles. The neurons, the first neuron is from the peripheral process of the neurons in the ganglia that constitutes the sensory nerves as in pain. The second neuron are different for fine touch and the crude touch. So, in the pathway for the fine touch includes the central process of the neurons in the dorsal nerve root ganglia enter the posterior white column of the spinal cord and form the fasciculus gracilis and the fasciculus cuneatus. These are uncrossed tracts. The second neuron lies in the nucleus gracilis or the nucleus cuneatus. It gives off the internal arcade fibers which cross to the opposite side through the sensory decussation. Reaching the other side, they run upwards in the medial lemniscus and the medial lemniscus ends in the posterolateral ventral nucleus of the thalamus. So, the fibers starting in the thalamus pass through the internal capsule and the corona radiata and end in the somatosensory area of the cerebral cortex, area number 312. The pathway for the crude touch. The central process of the neurons in the dorsal nerve ganglia terminate in the grey matter of the spinal cord. The second neuron lies in the spinal cord. Then axons of these neurons cross the midline and form the anterior spinothalamic tract. In the brainstem, this tract merges with the medial lemniscus. And the remaining, that is the third neuron and the termination of the pathway is similar to that of the pathway for touch, that is fine touch. Then now the pathway for proprioceptive impulses. The receptors includes the muscle spindles, the Golgi tendon organs, the Pacinian corpuscles and the uncapsulated nerve endings. So, diagrammatically we can represent, say, in the simplified manner like this. In the proprioceptive pathways are different for conscious and unconscious impulses. This diagram is showing the pathway for conscious proprioceptive impulses. So, the course is similar to that of the touch pathway, and in the unconscious proprioceptive impulses, the first neuron as similar to that of the pain. The second neuron fibers are represented by three tracts, that is anterior spinocerebellar tract, the posterior spinocerebellar tract and the cuneo-cerebellar tract. The anterior or indirect spinocerebellar tract is made up of mainly of crossed fibers arising from the spinal grey matter. The fibers ascend to the upper part of the pons and then turn down into the superior cerebellar peduncle. So, the posterior or direct spinocerebellar tract contains ipsilateral fibers arising in the dorsal or thoracic nucleus of the spinal cord. It enters the ipsilateral cerebellar hemisphere through the inferior cerebellar peduncle. So, in cuneo-cerebellar tract, that is posterior external arcuate fibers, it is functionally similar to the posterior spinocerebellar tract and it arises from the accessory cuneate nucleus which receives the afferents from the fasciculus cuneatus. The tract enters the ipsilateral cerebellar hemisphere through the inferior cerebellar peduncle. So, here you can see the anterior spinocerebellar tract which is represented in the blue color. So, here the fibers enters the cerebellum through the superior cerebellar peduncle, whereas the posterior spinocerebellar tract is represented in green color here and the cuneo-cerebellar tract represented in yellow color. So, these enter the cerebellum through inferior cerebellar peduncle. So, now the taste pathway. The taste from the anterior 2/3 of the tongue except from the valid papillae is carried by the cauda tympani, a branch of the facial nerve, till the geniculate ganglion. The central processes goes to the tractus solitarius in the medulla. The taste from the posterior 1/3 of the tongue including the valid papillae is carried by the cranial nerve 9, that is glossopharyngeal nerve, through to the till the inferior ganglion. The central processes also reach the tractus solitarius. The taste from the posterior most part of the tongue and the epiglottis travels through the vagus nerve till the inferior ganglion of the vagus. These central processes also reach the tractus solitarius. After a relay in tractus solitarius, the solitariothalamic tract is formed which becomes a part of trigeminal lemniscus and reaches the ventro-posteromedial nucleus of thalamus of the opposite side. So, another relay here takes the fibers to the lowest part of post central gyrus, which is the area for the taste. So, here next we will discuss about the visual pathway. The visual pathway includes the structures which are concerned with the reception, transmission and perception of the visual impulses. So, the structures concerned with the visual reflexes includes the retina, optic nerve, optic chiasma, optic tract, lateral geniculate body, the optic radiation and the visual area of the cortex. Then optic nerve. The optic nerve is made up of axons of ganglion cells of the retina. In the optic nerve is not a peripheral nerve because its fibers have no neurilemmal sheets. It is a tract. So, its fibers have no power of regeneration. The optic chiasma. So, in the optic chiasma, the nasal fibers, that is fibers of the optic nerve arising in the nasal or the medial half of the retina, including those from the nasal half of the macula, cross the midline and enter the opposite optic tract. The temporal or the lateral fibers pass through the chiasma to enter the optic tract of the same side. The optic tract. Each optic tract winds round the cerebral peduncle of the midbrain. Near the lateral geniculate body, it divides into lateral and medial roots. The lateral root is thick and terminates in the lateral geniculate body. A few of its fibers pass to the superior colliculus, the pretectal nucleus and the hypothalamus. The medial root is containing the supraoptic commissural fibers. So, each optic tract contains the temporal fibers of same side and the nasal fibers of the opposite side. Then the lateral geniculate body, it receives the lateral root of the optic tract. Medially it is connected to the superior colliculus and laterally gives rise to optic radiation. The cells in this body are arranged in 6 layers, that is layers 2, 3, 5 receives the ipsilateral fibers, that is the same side fibers, and the layers 1, 4, 6 receive the contralateral fibers. Optic radiation. The optic radiation begins from the lateral geniculate body, passes through the retrolentiform part of internal capsule and ends in the visual cortex. So, the visual cortex, here you can observe in the lateral view, the optic radiation in this striae area, that is area number 17, where the color, size, shape, motion, illumination and transparency are appreciated separately. The objects are identified by integration of these perceptions with past experience stored in the parastriate and peristriate areas, that is area number 18 and 19. So, here the ventral view can see the primary visual cortex. So, the area of the visual cortex that receives the impulses from the macula is relatively much larger than the part related to rest of the retina. So, now the pathway for the light reflex, light or the pupillary reflex. When the light is shown to one eye, normally the pupils of both eyes constrict. The direct light reflex means the constriction of the pupils upon which light is shown. Indirect or consensual reflex, the constriction of the pupil on the other eye even though no light is shown. So, the pathway for the light reflex, throwing the light on the eye causes constriction of the pupil. So, this is mediated through the retina, the optic nerve, optic chiasma, optic tract, the lateral geniculate body, the Edinger-Westphal nucleus, then the third cranial nerve, the cranial nerve itself, that is oculomotor nerve, and the ciliary ganglion, the short ciliary nerves and it constricts the pupillae after acting on the sphincter pupillae. So, throwing light on one eye produces constriction of the pupil in both the eyes, that is the consensual reflexes. So, that is due to the bilateral connections of the pretectal nucleus with the Edinger-Westphal nuclei. So, now the accommodation reflex, that is the constriction of the pupil also takes place when looking at the near object. This is mediated through the retina, then the optic nerve, the optic chiasma, optic tract, the lateral geniculate body, the optic radiation, the occipital cortex, that is visual area, the superior longitudinal fasciculus, the frontal eye field, the third nerve nucleus, and along with the Edinger-Westphal nucleus, then reaches the ciliary ganglion, the short ciliary nerve, and the sphincter pupillae muscle that causes the constriction of the pupillae and ciliaris. So, the pretectal nucleus is not involved in this reflex. So, in the lesion of the pretectal nucleus, the light reflex is lost, but the pupil contracts on accommodation, that is called Argyll-Robertson pupil. The clinical aspect, the effects of the lesions of different parts of the visual pathways. If the lesion is in the optic nerve, it causes ipsilateral blindness. The mid-sagittal lesion of the optic chiasma causes bitemporal hemianopia. Then lesion of the optic tracts causes contralateral homonymous hemianopia. Lesion of the temporal lobe affects the fibers of Meyer's loop coming from the lower half of the retina and causes contralateral homonymous upper quadrantenopia. Then lesion of the optic radiation causes contralateral homonymous hemianopia. Then lesion of the visual cortex causes contralateral homonymous hemianopia with macular sparing. So, here in the diagram you can represent the lesions with shading the particular part. So, now the pathway for the hearing, that is auditory pathway. The first neurons of the pathway are located in the spiral ganglion. They are bipolar. Their peripheral processes innervate the organ of Corti, while the central processes terminate in the dorsal and the ventral cochlear nuclei. So, here you can observe the dorsal and the ventral cochlear nuclei. The second neurons lie in the dorsal and ventral cochlear nuclei. Most of the axons arising in these nuclei cross to the opposite side, that is in the trapezoid body, and terminate in the superior olivary nucleus. So, here you can observe the superior olivary nucleus. The third neuron lie in the superior olivary nucleus. Their axons form the lateral lemniscus and reach the inferior colliculus. The fourth neurons lie in the inferior colliculus. Their axons pass through the inferior brachium to reach the medial geniculate body. The fifth neurons lie in the medial geniculate body. Their axons form the auditory radiation, which passes through the sublentiform part of internal capsule and reaches the auditory area in the temporal lobe. So, here you can observe the auditory cortex in the temporal bone, the inferior colliculus, then the internal retroventricular part of internal capsule and the medial geniculate body. The olfactory pathway, the receptors and the first neuron. The olfactory cells or bipolar neurons, they lie in the olfactory part of nasal mucosa and serve both as a receptors as well as first neurons in the olfactory pathway. The olfactory nerves, they are about 20 in number, represent the central processes of the olfactory cells. The second neuron, the mitral and the tufted cells of the olfactory bulb give off fibers that form the olfactory tract and reach the primary olfactory areas. The third neuron are located in the primary olfactory cortex that includes anterior perforated substance and several small masses of grey matter around it. The fourth neuron, fibers arising in the primary olfactory cortex go to the secondary olfactory cortex located in the anterior part of parahippocampal gyrus. Then the smell is perceived in both primary and secondary olfactory areas. So, the assignment, the questions are the pyramidal tract, visual pathway, gustatory pathway, light reflex and accommodation reflex. Thank you.